How about that? The Adult Music Podcast lives on into 2025. Who would have thought it?
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year, everybody.
2025. This is episode 196.
Oh, man, we're close to 200. It's amazing.
We skipped last week to get things fresh and ready for the new year, but we had good luck with our last episode, our best of favorites episode for 2024, and we received a lot of nice comments on Facebook about that. I want to give a special thanks to the artists and record labels that shared the episode: flutist Sami Unonen, drummer-composer Olivier Robin, our friend, guitarist Jason Kaiser, also Rhythm and Flow Records, Gleam Records over in Italy, and Origin Records. Thanks for sharing the episode. We had a lot of downloads, and it was fun reviewing some of our favorite recordings from 2024.
And I took maximum advantage of that week off we had and listened to all those records again, or at least a lot of them.
Yeah, I went back and just did some normal person listening.
That was nice.
For a couple weeks, yeah.
Just listening to something that's familiar, you know. It's a very different experience listening to something for the first time, all the time, like we do on this podcast.
And it was nice to have a clean start. Well, you instigated things when you said, I've got all fresh 2025 recordings for classical music this week.
I was a little surprised I was able to do that. And then on January 10th, which was 2 days ago, the classical floodgates have already opened. There's a lot of interesting stuff out there. So we're going to have more of that next week, but we'll talk about that later.
So I matched you tit for tat there. I got all new recordings for this episode, and next week I've got all January 10th releases as well. So we're just making things really fresh from the start this year.
Yeah, and I think I can actually make this continue because there are a lot of new releases that I can put out from classical music. And once we get into the end of February, hopefully things will still be coming out, but we'll have to see. I do know there are some great Hyperion releases coming out in February, so we're going to want to talk about those definitely, or at least one of them.
And in jazz, there are a bunch of things coming out on the 17th and 24th that I'm waiting for already.
Wow, fantastic. I'm looking forward to seeing what's coming out next week as well. I want to mention also in classical music, a lot of things are sort of built around the anniversary of composers' births and deaths. Right. This is one of the things you have to do when you have like a form of music that's now 700 years old. It used to be 400 years old until they opened up the scholarship to go back to the medieval times and through the whole Renaissance. But we have the 500th anniversary of Palestrina's birth. So there are a lot of Palestrina recordings coming out, which is nice. That'll mean some more church music to soothe your soul. And maybe not so happily for some of the less adventurous listeners out there, it's the 100th anniversary of Pierre Boulez's birth. Oh. And I guess we're going to have to hear one new album by him at least this year. I don't know what's going to come out, but we'll have to see. His music is kind of tough, though, but we'll get you through it. I know a little about it. I may have to do some research and really stretch my brain muscles or something to figure out what's going on in that.
Well, lots of things to look forward to and making a fresh start right from the beginning here in 2025. Before we get into the music tonight, I want to remind everyone that in the episode description, you'll find links to Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music for all of the recordings we're going to discuss. And at the top of the description, there's a link to the full episode playlist. That's all the music in one place on Deezer, CD quality streaming music from France. If you can't see the full description or the recording list and links are hard to access on your app, you can always come over and check us out on our host site, Podbean, podbean.com, where everything is easy to follow. And if you enjoy the podcast, please follow or subscribe wherever you listen to us and tell a music-loving friend. Help us to grow our audience. If you take a moment to give us a ranking or write a short review, that also helps us get listed in the music category recommendations. And it's another great way that people can find out about our show. Come over and follow us on Facebook as well to get extra info and more new releases during the week. I put up a couple from this Friday, and you can leave a message or comment there as well. You can follow us now on X too. Our ID there is Adult Music Pod. And if you'd like to contact us directly with any comments or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is adultmusicpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. We'll be playing music samples during our discussion, and this is our fair use disclaimer. Music sample clips are for commentary and educational purposes. We recommend that listeners listen to the complete recordings, all of which are available on streaming services in the links provided. And we also suggest that if you enjoy the music, you consider purchasing the CDs or high-quality downloads to support the artists. And we're ready to roll into some new music tonight.
All right, let's open up 2025. Now, this week I had 3, and even really more than 3. I had to choose between this rather compelling and really obscure list of recordings that came out on January 3rd, and I wound up pulling out 3 pretty interesting recordings that are a little off the beaten path. First of all, we have a recording of bassoon concertos, and we're going to start off 2025 with the bassoon. I bet you didn't see that coming. I didn't either until I actually programmed this this week. This is works by Crusell, Dupuy, Berwald, and Brendler, played by Jaakko Luoma on the bassoon, the Tapiola Sinfonietta, with Janne Nisonen as the concert master. They don't have a conductor. It's on the Ondine label. Came out on January 3rd, as did the other 2 albums that I'm going to talk about in classical music. All right, I'd like to paraphrase Bertil van Beur's booklet note in describing this program. He says something like, now I just read this and just wrote it down from memory, so it's not exactly what he wrote, but from the early 19th century, we have inherited the idea that there are 3 main instruments that concertos are written for: the piano, the violin, and to a lesser extent, the cello, with all other instruments occupying secondary status. It's kind of funny how classical music does that. Things just kind of fall into this pattern. And this is thanks to technical improvements that made the sound quality of these 3 instruments capable of establishing equality with the expansion of the orchestra, as well as virtuosos whose ability on these instruments made them popular. You know, the reason why we get so many piano and violin concertos is because of 2 people, Franz Liszt and Niccolò Paganini. There was never really anybody like that on the cello, but the cello did eventually become a big instrument. There were virtuosos on the cello, but I mean, not the flamboyant types like Liszt and Paganini. This wasn't the case in the Baroque and classical eras, as you know, when concertos were composed for virtually every instrument. Yeah, we hear them all doing incredible things in Baroque music. In the 19th century, solo concertos for the so-called secondary instruments, they're not really secondary, but in the 19th century, I guess they were considered that, were usually written by the soloists themselves and came to be overlooked by history. Yes, one of the wonderful things about living in our era is that there's really fantastic research being done into the music of the past, and a lot of these long-dead works are coming to light again. Many of the performers who had concertos written for them had contributed to the technical development of their instruments and had works written for them to showcase their skills. Yeah, this was true of Mozart's clarinet concerto and also Brahms's clarinet works as well. This is also the case with the German-born bassoonist Franz Karl Neumayer, who lived 1782 to 1853. He moved to Sweden with his 2 brothers in 1802, where they were employed in the state orchestra called the Hovkapell, or something like that. By 1829, Neumayer embarked, it starts with a P, by the way, if you want to look that up. P.N. Neumayer embarked upon a grand tour in Europe as a bassoon soloist, playing a new 11-key bassoon by the German firm Gresser and Wiesner that allowed him an expanded range up to a high E-flat. His technical virtuosity was notable for his use of the entire range of the instrument and fiery display. And you imagine that sort of thing on a violin. All 4 concertos on this album were composed for him by Swedish composers. All right. So Franz Karl Neumayer is really the inspiration for all of these works. The first concerto that we're going to hear is by Bernhard Henrik Crusell. This is his bassoon concerto in B-flat major Concertino pour le basson, written in 1829. Now, Crusell was a clarinetist and is most famous for his clarinet concertos, which have been well recorded. You know these, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think every great clarinet player has recorded them. He was a colleague of Neumeyer's in the military bands of Stockholm, and Crusell was also Neumeyer's father-in-law. So I guess Neumeyer married his daughter. How about that? Crusell was born in Finland and moved to Stockholm in 1791, and this concertino, more like a fantasy or Konzertstück, is in a single movement, but it takes up 3 tracks on the recording. Anyway, the first track is Allegro Brillante. This is the first, say, segment of this work. And it begins with a march-like ritornello, and it's a bit Mozart-like in overall sound. I mean, Mozart had really set the tone for the pre-Romantic era works. But at this point, 1829, Beethoven has already died, so his entire body of work is out there. We hear the two sonata form themes played by the orchestra first. The bassoon finally comes in at the 1 minute and 40-second mark, so there's a big, almost romantic length build-up to this, blending with the orchestra and plays in its very satisfying low end. Yes, Russ and I really love the low end of the reed instruments,
Indeed.
and we get a bit of that here. Luoma has an appealing tone, and let's sample just before his entry. I like the way he emerges into the overall sound, so keep an ear out for that. He gets a really long solo spot right at the beginning. And how about those very satisfying, reedy, low notes? We could hear there that he's playing lyrically, and then he flutters around the marching rhythm. In the 4th minute, we get to hear some athleticism from Luoma. Crusell, like us, seems to like the instrument's low end because he gives the soloist ample opportunities to dip down there. Though this is a single movement work, the first section unfolds like a typical sonata of the era, with its two opening themes repeating. At the end, though, there's a buildup of harmonic tension that doesn't end in a cadence, but leads to the bassoon playing a line that resolves into the slow, marching second movement. I don't know if I should call this a second movement. The second section, Allegro Moderato, I guess it kind of serves as a second movement, though it's connected. So the melody that begins this section is attractive and has a lot of playful turns of phrase when the melody starts developing. Let's actually hear the opening. I'm going to fade into it. Okay, I'm going to have to get out of this before the cadence comes, but you get the idea. At 2 minutes and 20 seconds, the bassoon enters into a virtuosic variation of the material, and I want to hear some of that virtuosity as well. We haven't heard that yet, but there's a bit of it in this piece and really on the album itself. Let's hear it. Yeah, that's some showy playing there and very impressive and difficult. I don't know what this looks like on stage. You know, is the bassoonist like really exciting to watch when he's doing this really incredible stuff? You got to listen to this with your ears. You know, violinists and pianists, at least, they look like they're making a big effort, you know? Anyway, the orchestra suddenly engages into a stormy build-up at the end of the section, which ends with an open cadence leading into the next section. And then we get to track 3, Polacca, which is a kind of dance. It's a raucous jaunty, bouncy movement with unexpected rhythmic and harmonic changes. Let's hear the opening and very catchy theme. Crusell has an ear for appealing melodies and playful phrasing and rhythm, and we get a lot of that in this movement. In the first minute, there are some operatic nods toward the 18th century comic opera in playful orchestral figures. I find myself hearing this movement as modeled on an opera buffa aria. It's got a lot of song-like twists in it. The movement is formed like a rondo with a returning theme. The bassoon takes on an Italian saltarello speed at the end of the movement to lead up to the exciting final cadence. Tracks 4 through 6, Bassoon Concerto in C minor by Edouard Dupuy, who lived 1770 to 1822, so basically within Beethoven's entire lifespan, but he died before Beethoven did. This piece is believed to have been composed in 1812 or around that date. Dupuy's life would make a fine piece of cinema, according to the booklet notes. He was born in Switzerland, trained in keyboard by Jan Ladislav Dussek, and in violin by Carlo Chiabrano in Paris. His first position as a musician at the court of Prince Heinrich in Prussia ended when he abruptly resigned his post by riding a horse into the middle of a church service. You don't really see that happening anymore, you know. He started a career as a solo violinist, winding up in Stockholm and being appointed as a tenor in the Royal Opera. His Jacobin leanings led to his being deported by Gustav IV Adolf, literally accompanied to the border by armed guards. So if you were a Jacobin, you were supporting the French revolutionaries and not the king. In Copenhagen, he had a torrid public affair with a royal princess, causing his banishment from Denmark, only to return to Stockholm in 1812, where he was appointed Kapellmästare at the Royal Opera. Despite a scandalous life, he made significant musical contributions to Swedish musical life of the Carl Johan period. The Bassoon Concerto is a lavishly orchestrated work. It's about 30 minutes long, in 3 movements, a big work with great demands placed on the soloist, and it's also my favorite piece on this album. Bertil van Boer's booklet notes claim that if this work were written for the violin, it would probably still be one of the main repertory works today. Let's see what we think. I'm going to say I kind of agree with that, but let's hear a bit of it first. Track 4, first movement, Adagio non troppo, going to Allegro moderato. So that indicates there's an introduction followed by a main, faster section. So the work has a quiet, somber, but warm opening in the strings. There's a horn fanfare that points the strings to the first cadence. A marching theme begins in the bass strings as the violins play a new theme with a Rossini-like feel to it. What is with these march rhythms? We heard at least 2 of them in the Crusell work, and here they are again. I should mention also that the recording is vivid and clear, with the bass elements registering with crispness. The timpani have good presence, and the strings come across with a warm sound. The lower end is well captured. And back to the work. A woodwind theme is next. This movement has a lot of thematic material. It isn't until the 3-minute and 10-second mark that the solo bassoon comes in over the marching rhythm. He repeats the original theme that was played over this rhythm. The orchestra answer by raising the volume and energy, and this leads to some virtuosity from the bassoon. Let's hear some of that. Wow. And get it down to that lower note. Now, you might notice that this has more of a Beethoven influence to it. It's more dramatic, has a bit of a dark edge to it with a high level of virtuosity, even though it was written long before the Crusell work that we heard first. You never know what composers are doing during this time. The lyrical second theme comes in after this display that I just faded out of. The solo part ends with a very satisfying low note, then we get back to the march rhythm and the recapitulation of the opening themes. The bassoon gets some chances at some difficult virtuosic lines over the material for theme 1. He's lyrical with the second theme again. The movement ends with some bassoon fireworks using the entire range of the instrument. There are cadenza-like passages, but the bassoon isn't given a segment with no accompaniment. Track 5 is the second movement, Adagio, the slow movement. Strings open the movement with a theme that gradually builds up and has a bit of a classical twist to its cadence. The bassoon repeats it, and I'm going to come into this when the bassoon comes in, because that's what we're here for, right? To hear the bassoon. Here we go. A little more on the Mozart side there. Really lyrical and beautiful. The movement picks up some energy in the middle section and retreats to the Adagio tempo for the repeat of the opening. It's got a pretty lyrical ending, with the bassoon ending on a sustained high note. Track 6, the third and final movement, Rondo, marked Allegretto. The Rondo theme has a swashbuckling quality. There's a Donizetti-like thumping rhythm in the pizzicato basses and cellos. Yeah, if you know Donizetti's opera L'Elisir d'Amore, the Elixir of Love, you hear that sort of rhythm in a lot of those arias. The movement is given robust energy by the Tapiola Sinfonietta. There's a solid cadence with vivid sound on the timpani. A more lyrical B section follows, with the orchestra following the bassoon's lead. When the orchestra takes over the theme, the bassoon goes into some impressive roulades, smoothly taken by Luoma. The rondo theme returns, reorchestrated a bit to sound a bit less bold. There's some impressive technique from Luoma in this section. In fact, this movement sounds like a workout for the bassoonist. Let's hear a little bit of that workout. Yeah, we don't get the cadence there. It just goes right back into the theme. Really interesting build-up of tension after that really incredible high-speed roulade. This is pretty exciting playing. The rondo theme again ends emphatically. Then at the 5-minute and 40-second mark, we get a downcast C section, the bassoon in lamenting mode, though he quickly snaps out of it with more impressive runs and roulades as the orchestra takes over the theme. The rondo theme returns as emphatically as it started at the beginning of the movement. The bassoon again gets a virtuosic section, more impressive here because he's been playing virtually throughout the movement, and indeed the three-movement work. The movement ends with an impressive run ending on a sustained high note in the bassoon. There's very impressive playing in this work, and I would highly recommend that listeners sample or just listen to this entire work. It's really a work that should be more famous than it is, and it's got some really exciting playing in it. Track 7, Franz Berwald, 1796 to 1868, Concertstück, or concert piece, in F major, opus 2, written in 1827, the year of Beethoven's death. Berwald was Sweden's most famous composer of the Romantic period. He took violin lessons from Edouard Dupuy, the composer of the previous work. He published a musical journal in 1818, but after the death of his father in 1825, he won a scholarship to study in Berlin and made his living as a physical and orthopedic therapist. It's a very different career than a musical one. He returned to Stockholm in 1849, where he managed a glass factory and attempted to get his music recognized. This Concertstück is really more of a small concerto. In the Romanza section, we hear a paraphrase of Henry Bishop's Home Sweet Home, which dates from 1823. This is a song everybody knows. You've just heard it in movies, and especially if you watch old movies. Berwald uses the song as a theme for a couple of variations. The work begins energetically with, again, a classical-sounding theme, meaning from Mozart's era and Haydn's era, pre-Beethoven really. The bassoon enters with large leaps into different registers, a pretty bold statement by the composer. After this, the theme becomes lyrical. At the 2-minute mark, we hear a new, slower section begin. It leads into a quicker, more virtuosic line after the 2-minute and 30-second mark. Again, Berwald includes some register changes between note pairs that are subtle but difficult for the soloist, and they're played impressively by Luoma here. At 4 minutes and 9 seconds, the slower section begins again, but is quickly interrupted by the orchestra building up tension and energy. The orchestra builds up to a cadence at 5 minutes and 4 seconds. A slow section begins at 5 minutes and 15 seconds, and this is the Romanza, and we can hear Home Sweet Home outlined here. I'm going to sample that section. The orchestra repeats the theme, and the variations on the bassoon follow, including one fairly stormy, spooky one with swooping orchestral accents. At 8 minutes and 22 seconds, we return to the opening theme, which has a similar mood to Home Sweet Home. The work's final section features virtuosic lines from the bassoon leading to its final cadence, which the orchestra builds up. The bassoon has some impressively fast, repeated notes heading to the final cadence. Track 8, the final work on the album, is by Eduard Brendler, 1800 to 1831, so he died at 30 or 31 years old. Divertissement in B-flat major, 1831, the year of his death, probably the year of composition. Divertissement is a light piece. Born in Dresden, in Germany, his family moved to Sweden. There's a lot of that going on, at this time. When he was a year old, he played the flute and made his debut at age 10, but his family had other ideas. Families always do, don't they? And he was apprenticed to a merchant in Visby on the island of Gotland. He did finally return to music. He died at around 31 of a sudden illness. That's all we get. This work was originally for bassoon and piano, and here we have it for bassoon and orchestra. Another march rhythm. This has a more slow procession rhythm at the beginning, complete with timpani percussion. The bassoon enters as a continuation of the opening melodic line, with some range-spanning descending lines added to the melody. The bassoon line has some registral leaps. The opening rhythm repeats at 1 minute and 28 seconds and soon goes off in another harmonic direction, building harmonic tension. At the beginning of the second minute, the bassoon has a brief cadenza before moving into a lyrical melodic theme, and I'd like to hear that theme. And we go into a new section after that. I really did like the floating tone of the bassoon in this sample. The tempo accelerates after the bassoon's theme, and we're now at a sort of quick andante. The bassoon's line is more ornamented and staccato here. After this, a slower, mournful minor harmony theme comes in. The theme gains more emotional intensity in its next incarnation. There are a lot of sustained tones in which we can hear Luoma's tone. At the 7-minute mark, timpani introduce a quicker, more vibrant rhythm, and a complete mood change to a suddenly bouncy theme. We're in a brighter major key now, and I'd like us to go off hearing this as the last sample from the album. I like the quick tempo and the really strong downbeat. It really makes this very appealing. In the 9th minute, the bassoon moves to an appealing dotted rhythm theme, and then the tempo speeds up to a chirpier theme. The piece heads to its final cadence with great confidence. The bassoon explodes into an impressive virtuosic line for the final bars, leading to the cadence that ends the work. And that's the album. It's nice to hear the deep, reedy sound of the bassoon as soloist throughout the album. It never gets tiring. Jaakko Luoma plays with athleticism and a deeply satisfying, reedy tone. He gets quite a workout on this album, particularly in the Dupuis work, which was my favorite. The Crusell work, like his clarinet concertos, is a pleasant listen and an enjoyable discovery. Berwald's work is mostly lyrical, with some challenging sections included, and Brendler's divertissement is really a set of variations, set on their way by its constantly returning two-note percussion rhythm. We heard a bit of that in the sample. It's an album of appealing and rarely, if ever, heard music, for an instrument that I'm happy to see being placed in the spotlight more and more on new recordings. Jaakko Luoma is an excellent advocate for these works, and this album is guaranteed to please.
Luoma shows off a great technique matched by his sense of musicality. The music style is familiar and easily enjoyable, but we're used to hearing works from this period on violin or cello, as you mentioned, so it's a treat to hear similar music played so well and appealingly on the bassoon, which we often hear relegated to more comic relief in orchestral parts. There's a lot of virtuosity on display, but wonderful phrasing and melody treatment too. Everything's well balanced between the solo bassoon and the Tapiola Sinfonietta, and the recording is both warm and detailed enough. Of the works, I most enjoyed the Crusell for the variety in the composition that covers the full range of the bassoon, and the Brendler Divertissement also has a lot of different enjoyable themes, and it packs a lot into a one-movement work.
Indeed, it does. All right, onward to an Italian composer, Luigi Hughes.
Doesn't sound very Italian.
Well, let me explain this a little bit, because I was a little puzzled by this guy's name. Now, Hughes is an Italian composer. He was born in Casale Monferrato in Piedmont in 1836. Now, I was kind of confused about his name because if an Italian saw this name, he'd probably pronounce it Hugues. So I was wondering, it looks like Hughes. An Italian would say Hugues. So I reached out to my friend, the Italian flautist, Andrea Ceccomori, who you may have heard of. He's made a few recordings. And he informs me that the name is pronounced both ways, but he thinks the English way, Hughes, is probably the better one to use. And I will say that. So Luigi Hughes, even though there's no H there. Anyway, this album is called Opere per flauto e pianoforte, which means works for flute and piano. The performers are Paolo Dalmoro on flute and Maurizio Fornero on piano. Fornero. I think I went to school with his uncle Frankie Fornero. Sounds like a Brooklyn Italian name. Anyway, this is on the Tactus label, and it came out on January 3rd. The composer's full name is Pietro Eugenio Luigi Hughes, or Hugues if you prefer. He was born in 1836 and died in 1913, so he had a pretty long life. He was a renowned flutist, organist, and composer, and also an important geographer, university professor, and one of the main supporters of the study of geography in Italian schools. He graduated from the University of Turin in engineering in 1875 and had an entire career devoted to geography. How do these people do this? He's a flautist, he's a geographer. Man, you're really carrying two big careers at once. As for his musical career, he began to study the flute at a very early age and performed as a pianist in tours in the main capitals of Europe, playing with his brother Felice, who was a flutist himself, or flautist. I'm going to go to flutist because I'm American. There you go. And he also played with his flutist friend Costantino Nigra. He held music posts at various music schools. He wrote more than 200 compositions. In the late 2010s, the musicologist Bruno Reiteri found Hughes' personal archives in Casale, his birthplace, and they contain all the works and manuscripts that were regarded as lost. Boy, talk about lucky. Anyway, the discovery will gradually enrich the repertoire of Italian flute music with new works. His compositions have a refined, always elegant, romantic style and are highly melodic. This is the first album entirely devoted to the music of Luigi Hughes. The performers use two period instruments for the recording. Paolo Dalmoro plays a Cuesnon 8-key transverse flute from circa 1880, and Maurizio Fornero plays a Pleyel concert grand piano from the end of the 19th century. The notes don't give us any information on the individual compositions themselves, beyond calling the program a masterly selection among the best original works of Hughes' vast production of flute pieces. These works are essential for understanding the deep soul, the truest nature of this composer. I should also mention that Hughes is known to all Italian flutists, including Andrea Ceccomori, because he wrote a book of exercises for the flute that all Italian flutists use, apparently. So Andrea knew who he was right away. All right, let's get into the music, though. Track 1, Sonata Fantastica, Opus 100, opens the album. The piano sound has a lot of room sound on it. It's pretty distant, as though recorded in a big room.
Yeah.
The flute, on the other hand, is right up front, though as he gets quieter, we hear that room sound surrounding his tone at well. Let's give you a sample from when the flute enters. You can hear both instruments. Italian engineers seem to like this sort of spacious room sound with the kind of halo of, reverb on the sounds. I prefer it to be drier than this. Not dry, naturally, but I feel like there's a little too much here. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of taste, really. Anyway, the impression I get from the recording is that we've walked into the hall where the musicians are rehearsing before the performance later on. It sounds like an empty hall, which is probably what it was. All in all, though, we get a good sense of the sound of both instruments. The piece itself is attractive, as you've heard, with an appealing melody. After the flute plays the theme, he gets some swooping lines that allow Dalmoro to show some virtuosity. The flute gets a lot to do in the first two iterations of the melody. The work is called a sonata, but behaves sometimes like a rondo, sometimes like a set of variations. We hear a variation of the opening theme toward the end of the third minute. You could even call the piece capricious, making it a capriccio. There's an upbeat rhythm at around the 3-minute and 20-second mark. After several intervening episodes, we hear the opening theme again toward the end of the 5th minute. What follows sounds like it could be considered a coda. It's a new idea in the piano and seems to be using the harmony of the theme to extend the section. It then goes into an extended section leading to the final satisfying cadence. Track 2, Capriccio Le Silfidi, Opus 29, number 2. Silfidi is sylphids, which are sort of air spirits. So we're going to get an airy quality in this movement. This has a dramatic piano opening followed by answering flute figuration. The main theme is dramatic, evoking stormy waters, though a sylph is, as I said, an air spirit associated with the wind. So I suppose the winds are stirring up the waters here. Anyway, let's hear a sample so that we know what I'm talking about. Dalmoro finds himself in the high end of his instrument for a good deal of the piece, and his tone finds a comfortable space between rounded and piercing. The tone is cushioned enough to be appealing at the high end, yet remains dramatic. The piano provides some severity in its articulating of the rhythm and forte dynamics, keeping the rhythm moving steadily. The sylph is a good theme to write a flute piece to. We get in the 4th minute a more dancing rhythm where the flute line cavorts and swirls, giving windy indications, moving here and there. Listen for this in the theme from 6 minutes onward. Both instruments have interesting parts, though of course you'll be drawn to the flute's characterization. The piece has a big dramatic final cadence. This is the piece I would sample if you want to hear the whole thing. I liked this piece the best on this album. Track 3, Serenata in Re minore, Opus 3. That's D minor. A quiet arpeggiated line starts the piano, and the flute plays the straightforward theme over that. This comes across as more of a drawing room piece. It's got a lot of appealing melodic ideas in it. The piano does get some brief opportunities to take over the theme. At the 2-minute and 30-second mark, a more ornate variation on the theme begins, with the piano playing swirling arpeggiated patterns to introduce his triplet chord rhythm. A new variation begins at around the 3-minute and 50-second mark, this time with the flute playing the swirling figuration. The flute figuration only builds to more impressive patterns until the sudden, quiet ending chord, and I'd like to hear that ending. Track 4, Sonata Romantica, Opus 57. Fornero on the piano starts this in a rather severe manner. Dalmoro on the flute comes in and softens the theme a bit with his tone and phrasing. The piece suddenly picks up energy from the 1 minute mark or so. A forte statement of the theme is heard at 1 minute and 57 seconds, and the section heads to a quiet cadence. There's a pause, and the piece takes off at a gallop at around the 2 minute and 10 second mark. The flute comes in with the theme after that, and that's what I'm going to sample. Man, when the music starts moving like that, it's sort of hard to fade out. At the 3rd minute, piano changes the rhythm and theme, with the flute repeating and building on its new theme. We hear a repeat of some of the previous material in the next sections. The flute gets quite a workout in this piece, as you heard a bit of at the end of that sample. Dalmoro is almost constantly playing and is given some naughty, though appealing lines. He has repeated note patterns that lead to the final cadence. Track 5, Sonata in Do Maggiore, or C major, opus 119. A triplet rhythm starts this piece, with the flute immediately going into the attractive theme with no introduction. There's a nice change to an operatic soprano-like laughing line in the flute. The opening section ends at 2 minutes and 13 seconds, and it sounds like we're in a slower movement afterward, with the flute playing a new theme over a new accompaniment in the piano. The piece then moves on to dramatic piano lines featuring quick upward-moving scales. The flute comes in to complete phrases, but this section belongs more to the piano. The flute then comes in with some naughty virtuosity. A version of the theme comes in a dotted rhythm at about 5 minutes and 45 seconds. We hear the laughing soprano figuration again in the flute, and the last minute of the piece is given to some quicker, more virtuosic playing in the flute. Very impressive in Dalmoro's hands. Track 6, Dans les Bois, or In the Woods, that's a French title, opus 67. This starts rather romantically with a rising line in the piano. I have to say, I like the expressivity of the Pleyel piano used here. When the flute comes in, it softens the contour set by the piano. The work has a mysterious fairy tale evoking quality. Hughes has a clever way of moving from section to section and introducing new appealing ideas into the work. At 4 minutes and 10 seconds, we start hearing some repeated notes from the flute, and I will play that. A little virtuosity is always very appealing. There's a rather piercing high note just after the 6-minute mark. Dalmoro has another high note at the very end, which he takes in breathily. Track 7, Sonata in Fa, that's F, Opus 95. The piano gives a brief meditative introduction. The flute comes in for the theme. He's got some involved figuration at the end of the thematic content. I rather like this theme at 1 minute and 15 seconds, so I'd like to sample that. Yet another theme appears after a brief piano interlude at around the 2 minute and 20 second mark. Again, Hughes' sonata has a capriccio quality to it in the way he introduces surprising new themes or variations on a previous one. In the 6th minute, a more subdued theme is heard and builds to a bit of a flourish at its end. The piece itself ends with a nice pattern of repeated notes from the flute. And that's the album. I enjoyed the playing of Paolo Dalmoro and Maurizio Fornero throughout. Dalmoro on the 19th century flute gets an expressive tone that he's able to manipulate to serve his interpretation well. I can see a work like the Capriccio Le Silfidi being taken up by flautists. It's dramatic and appealing and worth investigating. In fact, all of the music on the album is highly appealing, if rather light, though it does get dramatic in a 19th century romantic way at times. Paolo Dalmoro's breathy tone cushions the sound so that when he goes up high, the sound still falls gently on the ear. Maurizio Fornero's piano playing is rhythmically vibrant and livens the music up. One of the most appealing things about this album is that it gives us only 7 of Hughes' over 200 compositions, and they're chosen so that there's contrast between them. The entire album is imaginative in its manipulation of melodies in a way that we no longer hear in music of today. The music is light, but highly appealing. The only complaint I would have about this album is the empty hall room sound. I would prefer something a little bit closer and drier, but it's perfectly appealing the way it is now. A program like this is a great way for listeners to discover some of the best flute music by this composer who's unknown outside of Italy.
Both the flute and piano on this recording have unique timbres from their period. Additionally, as you mentioned, the recording has a real room sound, so it's like you're in a recital hall. The Hughes compositions are enjoyable with the romantic passion and require a lot of virtuosity, seemingly pushing the period flute to its limits in range and speed. And Dalmoro does an excellent job of handling the difficulties with a lot of musicality. The piano interaction from Fornero draws your ear in more active passages too, not merely as an accompaniment instrument. Maybe some would say the composing is overly busy musically, but I enjoyed it as an insight into what was possible with instruments of the time and to hear a composer that was new to me.
Yeah, it's just got the best elements of Italian music, like great virtuosity and beautiful romantic melodies.
Yeah.
All right, our first contemporary composer of the year has the spectacular name Hugh Shrapnel. Shrapnel was born in Birmingham, England in 1947, and this is an album of his chamber works. Now, I want to say it would have been super cool if a guy with the name Shrapnel produced music that sounded like shrapnel going in every direction.
But it doesn't.
It doesn't. It's light and very appealing music, and we'll get more into that with the samples. This is played by the Camarilla Ensemble. I'll mention them as they come up because they're different members playing on different pieces. This is on the Convivium Records label, and it was also released on January 3rd. Hugh Shrapnel started composing in an atonal serial music style, so I guess in keeping with his family name. But like so many composers, abandoned it for experimental music, and I think he would consider this to be experimental music. But don't worry, this music to me sounds a lot more like what you'd get from like Jean Francais in the mid-20th century. This sort of lighter, really more enjoyable melodic music with a lot of great tone coloring or timbral combinations in it. I'm going to be quoting liberally from Shrapnel's notes on the pieces provided in the booklet, so that's where these ideas are coming from. They're not necessarily coming from me, so I want to say that at the beginning because I'm probably not going to mention the booklet too often. Anyway, the first piece we hear is the Sonatina for Horn and Piano, composed in 2016. This features Jonathan Ferry on the horn, that's F-A-R-E-Y, and Alison Rind on the piano. It's lighthearted in content and traditional in form. The music alludes to various kinds of popular music, including music hall and Broadway. And yeah, this is a cheerful work all the way through. Track 1 is the first movement, Allegro. It's in quasi-sonata form. It starts with a cheerful piano rhythm. The horn comes in with an equally jolly melody, and jolly is a good word for this. Let's hear the opening. So that theme evokes a lot of smiles, as does the rather crafty piano playing, too. I like the little slight slowing down there around the 30-second mark. And there's a lot of expressive manipulation of the lines like that throughout the work, and really throughout the album. It sounds like fun to play. A second, more restrained but still relatively upbeat theme provides the second sonata theme. There's gorgeous horn tone from Jonathan Ferry here, completely without blemish in its smoothness. There's a development where fragments of the opening material is heard, all easily identifiable. The sort of fairground quality comes back at the end as the material repeats, and there's a brief coda to the end. Track 2, the second movement, Adagio, is in ABA form with a linking passage to the third movement. The piano has quiet chords at the beginning that are allowed to decay. The horn comes in with tentative staccato tones. Again, Ferry manages a full tone even at this timid volume. I like it when pianists really get up into those very high notes that no one ever plays because they barely sound, and we get to hear them here. It's rather nice. The theme has a lyrical center but becomes more forlorn toward the end. Those opening staccato notes figure heavily. The middle section is more legato in the horn. There's a sort of climax in the opening material at the 3-minute mark, after which the horn signals with a repeating figure to transition to the third movement. Track 3, the third movement, Con moto, is rondo-like. The rhythm suddenly picks up energy and we hear a bouncing melody. Now this connects from the second movement. I'm going to fade this up. Yeah, great writing in between the two instruments too, the way they communicate with each other, and this duo works very well together as well. In between iterations of the theme, there are brief somber sections, but the opening energy seems irrepressible and keeps coming back in rondo style. At the end, there's a brief slowing, then a buildup of energy to one final statement of the opening bouncy theme. The piece just stops mid-horn line without a final resolving chord. Odd and surprising, and that one part of the form isn't traditional. Tracks 4 through 8, Objet fixe for oboe, clarinet, horn, and tenor trombone. You want to keep that in mind. You have 3 instruments from a wind quintet and a tenor trombone as well. Rachel Harwood White plays the oboe, Nicholas Ellis on the clarinet, Jonathan Farry, horn, Simon Willis, tenor trombone. The composer was attracted by the sheer awkwardness of this particular instrumental combination, which largely dictates the angular, rhythmically taut, and harmonically astringent nature of the music. But don't worry, listeners, it's very appealing. Track 4 is marked fast, and it's very short. This movement inspired the title Objet fixe, which means fixed objects in French, because it's characterized by fixed objects, repeating interlocking musical phrases like the components of a machine. Each movement after this becomes more expressive and less mechanical in character. The instrumentation makes this angular, mechanical-sounding movement more appealing. They all play staccato and seem to be repeating material as in a Messiaen work. This is a very brief, at less than a minute. Track 5 is the second movement, Moderato. This sounds like it's going to fly off into space. The higher instruments play quick, rising scalar patterns, while the trombone and horn have staccato melodies. Let's hear a little bit of this. Alright, you get the idea. I really don't have to do too much more of that. There's a middle section that's slower and more spacious, and the opening A section returns for the end. Track 6 is the third movement, marked with a jazzy feel. The trombone plays a looping ostinato pattern as the upper winds have a Stravinsky-like line. I'd say this is jazzy in the early 20th century European sense, a kind of cubist look at jazz a la Stravinsky. There's a brief middle section that slows and dissipates the rhythm momentarily, but it comes right back. The movement ends in a coda with long sustained tones. Track 7, the fourth movement, marked con moto, has staccato repeating chords accompanying the clarinet in a swooping high-end line. The tone remains well-rounded and appealing in Nicholas Ellis's hands, and he's appealing in the middle section as well. All of these movements, save the first, seem to be in ABA form. Track 8 is the fifth and final movement, marked grave. Here the mechanical elements finally disappear as this movement is slow, reflective, and lyrical. It starts out with a heavy, dark sound, and it's far more melodic than the other movements. Let's sample a little bit of it. The movement ends with a bit more lightness in the quiet dynamic it takes on. Track 9, Coalition Blues for alto trombone and piano, composed in 2011. Simon Willis plays the alto trombone and Alison Rind on the piano. This was written for the trombonist Alan Tomlinson, renowned for his solo improvisations, who sadly died in February 2024. The piece is dominated by a quirky people's theme, that's in quotation marks, representing working people struggling against the effects of the coalition's austerity program. I wonder if that has to do with recent times. Well, it's written in 2011, so I think it might have been a bit ahead of its time. The ending expresses hope for a better future. The opening has a heavy, circus-like quality to its rhythm. The trombone plays loudly and lets out a growling tone at one point. It then plays with a mute. The piano plays icy notes in its very high range in accompaniment. At 1 minute, a repeating ostinato chord in the piano accompanies a more melodic theme, and let's hear a little bit of that. As I faded out, the muted trombone came in. The ending brightens up with a rising theme that ends suddenly. Track 10, Trio for Flute, Clarinet, and Piano, composed 2015 to 2022. The 2015 date reflects the fact that this was originally written for clarinet, violin, and piano, but Shrapnel thought the violin part seemed unsatisfactory, so he rewrote it in 2022 for the flute. This features Julian Sperry on the flute, Nicholas Ellis on clarinet, and Alison Rind on piano. There are many changes of tempo and mood in this work, but the work is based on the perky clarinet tune. Though there's no program, in the back of his mind, Shrapnel had the idea that the main tune was an individual going on some kind of journey with many ups and downs, finally coming to rest in the last section in which the tune is transformed by being inverted. I like the opening, almost birdsong-like theme in the clarinet, which the flute then takes over, and I'd like to sample that. The parts have a mechanical, interlocking quality. Shrapnel nevertheless manages to catch the ear with appealing melodic shapes within this mechanical framework. As the composer mentions, the mood and tempo change often, but go back to that mechanical beginning often too. We hear the entire range of the flute and clarinet, and particularly the clarinet, as the piece goes on. All of these changes are easy on the ear, mostly due to the timbres used in the piece. It's a creative, appealing work, probably my favorite on the album for its wealth of ideas, squeezed into less than 8 minutes. There are some pretty, tranquil piano lines in the 6th minute, before the flute and clarinet both rudely awaken the piano's dream to lead to a more boisterous, manic-depressive approach to the end. So that's track 10, Trio for Flute, Clarinet, and Piano. I recommend listeners sample this track. Track 11, Belladonna, for flute and piano, composed in 2004. Julian Sperry on flute, Alison Rind on piano. The piece is written without bar lines in a rhythmically fluid relation between the flute and piano. The English folk name for Belladonna is Deadly Nightshade, and the title refers to the heady, sensual, dreamlike character of the music, with its dark overtones and Belladonna's long history of use as an anesthetic, cosmetic, and poison. The piano starts with a meditatively light tone. I like the piano lines Shrapnel comes up with and the sensitivity Alison Rind plays with. The flute emotes with a full, breathy tone over this, and let's get a sample. The piece comes across as mysterious, and I love the flute's winding lines, beautifully played by Julian Sperry. Tracks 12 through 14, Sonata for Clarinet and Piano, composed in 2020. Nicholas Ellis clarinet, Alison Rind piano. This is modeled on classical forms like the horn sonatina was, but this piece is much more intense. Track 12 is the first movement, marked moderato. It starts innocently, but is interrupted by disturbing elements before coming to rest in a blissful but poignant nostalgic reverie tinged with sadness. A syncopated repeating chord lays the harmonic bed for the rather cheerful clarinet theme at the opening. I really love the writing there, too, with the piano having the clarinet sort of echo its theme at the end. There are some pleasing repeated phrase endings from the clarinet when the piano takes the theme. We heard them there. Another theme suddenly starts up, also cheerful. Then we're back to the opening theme. At 2 minutes and 10 seconds, there's a turn to a more severe mood, but it dissipates by 2 minutes and 37 seconds, turning to a wistful memory of the opening theme. Track 13 is the second movement, Andante, so the slow movement. It's somber and tragic in mood, marked by lamentoso with blues-tinged harmonies. Like the first movement, it builds up to powerful climaxes before subsiding into a desolate ending. The piano accompaniment comes across as mysterious, with the clarinet coming in with a dark-tinged gliding theme. The mood is one of mystery, of the kind you might feel in a dark forest. The climax comes with a high note in the clarinet at the 2 minute and 21 second mark, and we'll hear that about 20 seconds into this sample. And the music goes on. The piece ends as mysteriously as it began, and a bit downcast. Track 14, the third movement, Con molto. This has a driving 3+2+3 rhythm on the piano, over which the clarinet plays a spiky, disjunct theme which is repeated as a rondo. It builds to a dramatic climax to finish. The syncopated piano line has a terraced quality to it in the sense that I feel like it has different sort of levels somehow. The clarinet comes in with a chirping theme played staccato. Let's hear that. We're going to hear the 3+2+3 rhythm too. The theme sounds playful, but suddenly turns more serious, and just as suddenly, playful again. Alison Rind here provides a lot of rhythmic drive. Most of the movement keeps to a more playful mood, the mood of the rondo theme. The departures get dramatic and aggressive. The movement and piece ends with a sudden, unexpected, and inconclusive leap by the clarinet into the high register. And tracks 15 through 20, the final piece, Hilly Fields for Wind Quintet. The Wind Quintet features Julian Sperry on flute, Rachel Harwood White on oboe, the first time we're hearing her on this album. Nicholas Ellis on clarinet, Louise Watson on bassoon, and Jonathan Ferry on horn. This work depicts areas of southeast London where Shrapnel has lived most of his life. Hilly Fields is a park lying between Ladywell and Brockley, not like the vegetable, it's spelled Brockley, in southeast London. So this is kind of, in inspiration, it's sort of like Respighi's Pines and Fountains of Rome. It's sort of painting pictures of scenes in the park. Track 15, this is the first movement, Morning Run, originally for oboe and piano. A picture of the hustle and bustle of the park. The opening has a sunrise feel to it, and then there's a pause, and a bustling set of lines appears. It all sounds very cheerful, and let's hear that opening. Track 16 is the second movement, Reverie. This is a portrait of a lone figure on a park bench, thinking and dreaming. The tempo slows here, with the lighter winds playing a lilting figure in the higher end, while the bassoon provides a bass anchor. The interweaving bassoon and higher winds are a pleasure for the ear. Track 17 is the third movement, Games. It's a dance-like piece inspired by the various sports and games that take place in hilly fields. The rhythm livens up again. This has a similar feel to the opening movement, except that the various lines sound more focused and concentrated here, not as free as the opening movement. There are some sudden tempo changes. I rather liked the one that appears at around the 1 minute and 20 second mark, with the various ostinato lines it contains. The movement ends suddenly and surprisingly. Track 18, Movement 4, Blythe Hill. Another slow movement, atmospheric in character, with a chirping oboe and somber clarinet, the bassoon playing a pedal point bass. The patterns change, but there's a texture that keeps returning, the ending is slower, and the last chord sustained. Track 19 is the fifth movement, Dusk. A lone walker wanders around the park, encountering the odd dog walker or jogger, as well as nocturnal creatures. This piece is more complex in form than the others. The rhythm here has a loping, comic sort of quality to it. It feels like a bit of a scherzo. The material perks up at about the 42nd mark and now has a steady rhythm, with the opening French horn bass line returning afterwards, probably symbolizing someone nosily looking here and there. We more or less go back and forth between the two sections. The flute ends the movement with a solo line that connects this movement to the final one, which is called simply Fair. This is track 20. A celebration of the annual Hilly Fields Fair. This starts with a lively feel. The flute leads the way, with the other instruments providing accented chords and contrasting lines. It's a light-hearted affair, coming across in pastel timbres, nothing thick or heavy about the writing. It's a cheerful ending to a mostly light and cheerful album. This is all immediately appealing music, played with conviction by the musicians involved in the project. Though there are brief dark moments, one gets the impression that Hugh Shrapnel is a cheerful soul, judging by his music. A lot of this music is rhythmically upbeat in a lighthearted way, with appealing melodic material. The harmony sounds modernist, like he's a fan of early 20th century music. There's a bit of Stravinsky in there at times, but this music rarely gets aggressive. There's a pastel quality to a lot of it, probably because of the wind instrumentation. All of these works fall easily on the ear, and the performances are first-rate, always important for new music, because they're making a first impression. The mood of these pieces reminded me, as I mentioned, of Jean-Francais's very entertaining works. The music is lighthearted, and it's an entertaining discovery.
Yeah, there's a lot of variety in Shrapnel's compositions, and he's excellent at wind arranging.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
Sonatina for horn and piano is more traditional and attractive, and the work for oboe, clarinet, horn, and tenor trombone has unique instrumentation and really interesting contrasts in the brass syncopation and more linear woodwind lines. Belladonna for flute and piano was mysterious and intriguing. I enjoyed the contrasts in the sonata for clarinet, and the hilly fields for wind quintet held my interest, with the arranging and diversification of line movement for different instruments, and just lots of lovely melodic ideas. Really enjoyable contemporary music. Okay, over on the jazz side, all fresh 2025 releases here as well, and this week's jazz common thread is a unique take on composition. We're going to start out with something a little different with Armenian influence. Now, we've heard some Armenian jazz before on the podcast. That was back in episode 176, Loads of Modes, when we heard a release from Armenian pianist Tigran Tatavosian. And here we've got a young trombonist. I believe this is his debut recording, Haik Demirchian. And the recording is Crossroads on Masis Records. And Demirchian is a trombonist and recent Eastman School of Music graduate, originally from St. Louis, Missouri. He studied Armenian folk music in Armenia and the U.S., and he blends those influences together with jazz and his classical training. He incorporates Armenian, Black, and Western classical music traditions to bring out something unique in his own performances. On this recording, Demirchian's on trombone, Ryan Barsky on drums, Sebastian Klaas on bass, Leon Su on piano, and Thomas McCloskey on bass clarinet. Those musicians are on the first 4 tracks, and the remaining 4 tracks are just a duo format with piano that's played by Darius Terafenko. The recording is produced by Demirchian himself, the recording engineer on tracks 1 to 4, Matt Rammerman, and on tracks 5 to 8, John Hasselbach III, and it was recorded in Rochester, New York in May and July of 2024. We're going to start off with a Demirchian original composition, Armenian Blues. The drums and a bass ostinato get this started with an 8-measure intro. Piano joins in for another round. It's a neat minor modal mood with some unexpected notes, and Demirchian is in with the melody that shows some nice lip flexibility on the trombone. It's 24 measures, kind of like a 12-bar modal minor blues that's stretched out to double length, with a neat break at the end to work into the start of his solo. Let's check out this recording and hear how things get going. That's pretty cool. And as he goes along, Klaus gets the bass chugging for a walk in spots. Let's come back in to hear some more of this solo. Interesting modal ideas mixed with bluesy phrases and tricky rhythms. Klaus gets a bass solo next with some neat double-stopped ideas and works into the high register. He brings the ostinato back to usher in a final melody section from Demirchian. And with this tune, we're not in Kansas anymore, or St. Louis either. Track 2, Giant Steps. Something familiar to all jazz fans here. The title track to John Coltrane's 1960 classic recording. Demirchian takes the melody over just the drums and launches into improvisations before getting joined by bass and piano. I like the drive and ideas that let you hear the changes in your head. Let's hear this one get going. He really gets a chop workout on the solo here, and he gets back to the melody a bit, and then Barsky has some drum decoration time. Let's hear the end of his solo into the drum section. And to a final melody section there that brings it to a sudden ending. Track 3 is Kamancha, which is an Armenian folk song. A modal melody here made more mysterious with Thomas McCloskey doubling the lines on bass clarinet with Demirchian's trombone. It's a long melody at 64 measures in a 3-beat meter, seemingly with 8-measure sections. There are some harmonic shifts as it flows along, and we can hear some of it in a minute's sample. Demirchian solos first. He gets some interesting tricky lipped lines and edgy tone that sets a kind of primal mood. Let's check out some of that. Interesting cries there. On this tune, Sue has a piano solo that balances chordal ideas with some flows of runs before the horns are back with new variations on the melody. Of course, I was hoping for a bass clarinet solo too, but I got my wish on the next track, which is a Demirchian original, Sogoman. This tune has a 6/8 feel and more unison bass clarinet and trombone lines that are syncopated, tricky, and unpredictable, weaving through the harmonies to a nice climax before Demirchian's solo. And as I said, this one has the bass clarinet solo, which we never pass by here at Adult Music because we love the bass clarinet.
Did we do?
So let's check it out. Let it go on a little longer so we could catch some of that low-end readiness there. And Demirchian joins back in with some backing lines, and the horns join up again for a final slinky melody section with final falling notes. Track 5 is called the Choro. This is another Demirchian original, and from here the final tracks are just duo tunes for piano and trombone with Darius Terefenko on the piano. This has a flowing feel with nice interplay between the two with lush harmonies. Let's hear the opening section. And I'll just continue on from there so that you can hear Demirchian's solo interlude with some tricky intervals and slide work once Tarafinko returns. He works into the higher register, creating a sense of insistent longing, and Tarafinko gets a dreamy solo section with lots of sustain. Demirchian's ending is acrobatic and surprising, with some piano dissonance. Track 6, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Ampi Takik, which is a composition by Armen Tigranian, an Armenian composer. His best-known work is Anush from 1912. It's the first opera ever performed in Armenia. This one is interesting. A rubato unison left-hand piano and trombone line starts the melody. It sounds like part of a double harmonic major scale, giving it an exotic mood. Demirchian continues on with a soft, almost weeping line. Sometimes you can hear just air. Let's check it out. There's that opening scale line idea returning in his lines as Tarafinko's piano backing becomes more chordal and sometimes percussive. Just before 3 minutes, the dynamics change and Demirchian pushes the volume with lines that cry out into the upper register to a climax, and it comes down to a soft ending with the now familiar scale line. Track 7, Darn That Dream, from Jimmy Van Heusen from the 1939 Broadway musical Swing in the Dream, something familiar from the American Songbook now. I like the little interval figures that drop into the familiar melody at the start and the low register lazy phrasing. Let's hear it get started. Tarafinko takes a solo on this one that really rings out, so let's hear some of his playing on this tune. Demirchian returns with improvised lines that soar higher with glisses but stay relaxed even in his final little cadenza. It's dreamy after all. And track 8, the final tune, is a folk song, Kele Kele. This has a placid and simple folk melody in Demirchian's warm lower register with piano chords and chiming decorations. He takes the idea up an octave with some variations, making it more longing. Then things get surprisingly rhythmic and animated just before 2 minutes, which is where we'll jump in to take a sample from. Stays animated after his improvisations with some synced up lines with piano, and then returns to the original slower feel for a warm-toned ending. And that's it. An interesting debut, one standard, a Coltrane composition, and a lot of Armenian melodies with modal moods. The programming is unique, starting out with a full rhythm section, adding in McCloskey's bass clarinet, and then the second half being a duo with piano. Demirchian has a rich, full trombone tone, strong chops and agility, and he sounds confident improvising over tricky jazz progressions like giant steps and in the Armenian music that he's studied. I'll keep an ear out for him and whatever he does next.
Yeah, the program on the album is really interesting. It starts upbeat, and by the end it's reduced to trombone and piano, with the tunes getting heavier in mood by the end. Demirchian's solos on the album are really interesting, especially in the first 4 tracks, often veering off suddenly into an unexpected direction or figuration. He'll go slow to suddenly fast and things like that. And he puts across a sense of spontaneity. It works well, and it all sounds of a piece, too. Now, in those first 4 tracks, I have to say, I wasn't too happy about the piano being entirely in the left channel. It switches to a fuller sound for the last 4 tracks, but, we always have that piano in the other room and we're hearing it through a doorway effect. Now, I get that, this was the way jazz was recorded in the 50s and 60s, but I don't know, I feel like you should have the whole band panned across, the stage on a modern album. So that's really my one complaint about those first 4 tracks. When the piano solos, we hear it well enough, but we don't get the full impact of the sound as a result, at least not in the first 4 tracks. The brass are in the right channel there and sound great for the beginning with solid presence. The ending of the album, featuring duets with trombone and piano, gets a bit heavy and sad until 2 minutes into Kele Kele, where an upbeat rhythm brings relief from the sadness. It's an interesting album, particularly for the modal Armenian melodies and Demirchian's solos, and it's certainly worth exploring.
Yeah, an interesting start, and he's got the chops to do a lot of stuff, I think, so we'll see whatever he comes up with next. All right, continuing the interesting composition theme, next is Hidden Gems, a self-release from guitarist and composer Brent Laidler. Laidler attended Western Michigan University, majoring in music education with a minor in composition. He also owns and operates Brent's Bench, a band instrument repair shop in Lafayette for more than 30 years. His previous releases include Wouldn't Be Here Without You from 2022 and a large ensemble recording from 2017, No Matter Where Noir, N-O-I-R. For this recording, he went through fake books going back as far as the 1920s to find music that he could reshape into new compositions. Most of the original music he used here as sources never became standards on their own, but he felt that a lot of the tunes had cool enough changes that could be reworked into modern tunes, and it's a project that he worked on over having free time during the COVID pandemic. The compositions here are not contrafacts, the notes state. So we talk about contrafacts a lot on the jazz section of the program, and there's a similar idea in classical music as well.
Right.
When we take a harmonic structure of a tune and then compose a new melody over it.
In classical music, it happens in masses a lot, and from the Renaissance era.
Right. We heard a couple a few weeks ago on that vocal album. Here we've got more of adaptations with new melodies and also reharmonizations kind of based on the original form, sometimes recomposed. And Laidler chose tunes that he felt were fun to improvise on, and his ending compositions and new creations here are quite a bit different from the originals. And he also named his versions in ways that give hints to the original inspirations. And I want to thank Brent for writing back to me right away and giving me some more info on the original inspirations for some of these compositions. On the recording, Brent Laidler on guitar, Mark Buselli on trumpet and flugelhorn, Ned Boyd, alto sax and flute, Jamie Newman on the organ, Richard Sleepy Floyd on the drums, and Scott Pizarra on bass. And the recording is going to get underway with a tune called Haba Verde, which translates to green bean, and is a reference to Kermit the Frog.
Really?
Yes.
That's interesting.
I'm not sure what the inspiration for this tune is musically, though. This is a sunny Latin tune. It starts with an 8-measure intro featuring Newman's organ. I like the lifting changes into the melody, which is 40 measures and has a happy unison theme with guitar, flute, and trumpet. The trumpet splits off on lines in the middle sections and then returns for the final A section before Newman's off on an organ solo. Let's hear the recording get started. Then Newman's off on an organ solo from there. Bocelli gets a melodic trumpet solo as well, and then Laidler is up on guitar, so let's check out our leader's solo on this first tune. Nice flow and rhythmic snappiness. Boyd's there with a flute solo next, and Peraza has a nice solo on electric bass as well. It sounds fretless before another run through the sunny melody and a little extended ending. Track 2 is number 5, Show Me Day Way. The notes say this was a Dave Brubeck waltz originally written for a television show that only lasted one season. I investigated and found it. It's the theme from Mr. Broadway from 1964, and you can find it on YouTube, and also the recording Dave Brubeck's Greatest Hits from 1966 has this as the last track. It's actually a 12-bar blues in 6/8, and here Laidler has put it in 5/4, and Sleepy Floyd gives it a New Orleans-style backbeat that gets it going right from the intro. Boyd's on alto sax here, working the melody lines with Bocelli that start in unison and then split. And he's also got the first solo, so let's take a listen into the start of the sax solo. Nice tone there. Laidler follows, and then Bocelli on trumpet. So let's jump back in for his trumpet solo on this one. Newman's next on organ, and Peraza gets a bass solo on this one too. A couple rounds of the melody with final phrase repeats wraps it up. Track 3, Gemini. This one's based on a Cannonball Adderley composition, Morabi, which does not appear anywhere in print, the notes say, except in an anthology of solo transcriptions. And Laidler has added an original bridge as well as the new melody. You can find this on Cannonball Adderley's recording from 1968, Accent on Africa. And Adderley also had a well-known tune called Gemini from the 1962 Sextet in New York album. So I guess that's where the play on this name comes from as an inspiration. Now, the original tune had the Adderley Brothers horns starting it out with Latin percussion and actually a big band backing it, although you can't find out who's playing in it from any of the notes on that recording. This starts out with Boyd's solo alto sax and then gets into a kind of calypso mood. Laidler joins Boyd with the melody from the new B section that he's composed, and Boyd is up for a solo first. Let's check it out. And let's hear Newman's organ solo on this tune, into a little bit of Laidler's guitar solo. It's a really happy sounding tune, and don't miss the little unexpected modulation departure at the end of the final melody section. Track 4 is Ballad for B, and the notes say this is loosely based on Bobby Hutcherson's Little Bee's poem, and the B in this case is going to be Mark Buscelli, who takes this one on flugelhorn. The original recording from Bobby Hutcherson is from his 1966 Components album. Now, the original tune was a waltz, and here Laidler has made a more moody atmosphere with sustained organ and guitar chords setting up Buscelli's melody. Warm lyrical playing throughout from Buscelli on this one, with an organ solo from Newman that gets a nice shimmer to the tone, and Laidler has a laid-back guitar solo too. Track 5 is Riffy Business, and this is based off from a Vince Guaraldi riff that was used, the notes say, in the soundtrack to the first Charlie Brown television special. But if I'm not mistaken, the first one is the Christmas special, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Although he actually had made a recording of Charlie Brown music before it was ever used in a TV show. So I'm not sure where this was from. Interestingly, the notes say that Laidler found a very similar riff from a 1920s chart for the tune Bye Bye Blackbird, And also they found out that it's also the first 4 bars of the changes to an Earl Hines song called Rosetta. Now, if you're a Gen Xer like Mike and I, you'll recognize the intro riff right away. For a lot of us, Vince Guaraldi's music in the Charlie Brown specials was probably some of the first jazz we heard before we knew what jazz was, but it stuck in our minds.
Right.
Laidler has made a 32-measure melody for the horns and his own guitar that works in that riff over a throbbing samba groove with great bass from Peraza. Let's take a listen. Newman's up first from there with an organ solo. Buscelli follows on trumpet, but let's check out another solo on guitar from Laidler on this tune. Warm-toned and snappy melodic ideas. Boyd gets the final solo on alto with some edgy tone before they get back to the riffy business melody. Track 6, Somewhere in Central Park. This is from Horace Silver's Summer in Central Park. That tune was originally a waltz. Here they've got it in 4/4 so it can really swing. This original tune you can find on Horace Silver's 1972 In Pursuit of the 27th Man. Now, his original song has vibes and snappy bass lines to that waltz feel. Here, after the organ intro, Laidler has made a nice harmonized horn arrangement, and I like how the snappy bass lines give way to walking bass on the B section of the melody that sets the idea up for the really swinging solos that start with Buscelli. Let's check it out. After Buscelli, Laidler has a really springy guitar solo, and let's check out Boyd's alto solo on this tune. And they get into some trading fours with Floyd from there before a final round of the melody and an organ outro from Newman. Track 7 is Evening Song, and the notes say that this was a working title that Laidler decided to keep. It's based on some changes by Michele Petrucciani, and I don't know the tune that inspired this one, but the horns have a cool intro to this tune. Laidler takes the 32-measure melody on guitar over a relaxed bossa beat, and the horns layer back in to thicken it up. Let's take a listen. This relaxed feel. Laidler, Buscelli, Newman, and Boyd all get solos on this tune. Track 8 is bop-like, and the notes say it closely follows an old obscure ballad called Close Enough for Love. Laidler's not sure where he first heard it, but he recognized it once he started playing it. I don't think I know this tune, and I couldn't find out where it comes from. The form is kind of unique. It's AABA with 12-measure A sections and an 8-measure B section. Laidler gets the melody started, and they pass the baton around the band for the different sections of the melody. I like these chord changes. They have spots for bluesy ideas and boppy turnarounds. The solos get a similar shared treatment with some trading time for Floyd's drums. Track 9 is Petite Parasol. This began as a tune called Mimosa, but it changed enough through the edits, the notes say, that the final product doesn't much resemble the original. This has a funky reggae kind of groove to it, starting with an 8-measure intro. The melody is an AABA construction, the A's with a minor mood, and there's a lifting major kind of contrast to the B. There's an extra 4-measure transition after the final section before the rhythm doubles up for the solos to get started from Laidler. That's where I'm going to jump in for this sample. Bassoon, Newman, and Boyd all get in on the action. Let's jump back in to hear some horn hits and drum action from Floyd that transitions back to the original feel of the tune. Change up there and back to the melody from that point. And the final track, Without a Tress. The notes say this is an amalgam of tunes that Laidler liked pieces of but wouldn't make the cut as standalone tunes. This turns out to be a minor waltz, minus the horns here, just a rhythm section. After an 8-measure introduction, it's in an AAB construction with 16-measure sections. The B section turns major and hopeful sounding, but twists back to the minor with bluesy hints. Laidler gets it going and Newman takes the B section. Let's hear the main tune. Section there. Laidler takes a couple rounds of solo here, so let's jump in midway to hear some of his playing on this final tune. A melodic and clear-toned organ solo here, too, before they wrap it up with another round of the melody and some final thoughts. And that's the recording. Anyone who's ever composed songs knows how you often have to work hard to make them not sound like another song or follow in the same progressions that are locked into your memory from your musical experience. Here, Laidler has taken a different approach, and made new tunes from the best bits that he found inside other songs already, and the results are really enjoyable. There are a variety of styles and grooves as well as structures to the tunes. The arrangements make fun use of the two horns with a bit of flute too. The rhythm section is solid with Peraza's electric bass and Floyd's drums. Newman's organ makes the atmosphere and provides a lot of melodic solos. Fine horn solos from Boselli and Boyd, and Laidler's guitar solos are warm and fluid. What's old is new again after polishing up some fine gems.
Yeah, what's old is new again. That's sort of a recurring theme in the 21st century, I think. A lot of old things come back. And this turned out to be a really pleasant listen, and there are some much-loved sounds by the Adult Music Podcast on the album. Jazz organ, guitar, flute. We love all of these instruments, so it just was really a good listen. Most of the soloing goes for something melodic, I noticed, really on every track. They're really trying to bring out the song-like quality of these tracks. Brent Laidler on guitar is very generous to the other musicians on the album. He really doesn't solo as much as you'd think he would, being that he's the leader. But when he does, his solos come across as breezy and melodic, and really everybody else's do too. He just sort of unexpectedly appears among the solos. You really never expect him to come in, and then there he is. All the soloists build subtly on their melodic material, and a lot of the stylings in the solos sound to me like they come out of the 1970s. They had that kind of a groove to me, really my childhood. So a lot of the kind of songs that we heard on the radio of the time. This whole laid-back vibe and casual way reminded me of certain 1970s pop songs. It's a soothing mid-tempo album. A lot of these tracks are mid-tempo, I noticed, too. Good for chasing away the hangover and getting you back on your feet, I thought.
Right. Something I need at this time of the year.
Right. Maybe that's...
or any time of the year, actually.
I'll have to file this away for when that happens.
All right, in our final recording and completing the interesting composition theme for this week's episode, a recording of the music of Greg Hill, a composer we've come to enjoy a lot on the podcast in the past couple years. This is called Tribute, the music of Greg Hill by pianist Rick Rowe, and it's on Hill's Cold Plunge Records label. It came out January 1st. Now, we've heard a lot of Greg Hill's music on the podcast. Going back to episode 91, Low String Theory, we heard Oasis, the music of Greg Hill. That was on the Origin label by bassist Rodney Whitaker. Episode 110, Baroque and Bones, we heard The Other Shoe, the music of Greg Hill, also on Origin by trombonist and now baritone saxophonist Michael Deese. Episode 127, Something in the Ether, from August of 2023. We heard the Technocats, the music of Greg Hill. That was on Cold Plunge Records as well. We really liked that recording.
I have most of these on CD. It's kind of, that's what happens, I guess. I like Greg Hill's music.
And then in March of last year, episode 155, Golden Hours, we heard The Doors Open, the music of Greg Hill. That was on OA2, part of Origin Records by guitarist Randy Napoleon. Now here we've got it in a trio format, piano trio, by Rick Rowe, who's a pianist, composer, and educator in southwestern Michigan. He's produced over a dozen recordings with leading jazz musicians. His first recording of his own on his own label, R&R Unknown Records, was called Monk's Modern Music, and that was with Rodney Whitaker and Greg Hutchinson. He's taught at Michigan State University, and he's also been a guest artist and clinician at the University of Arizona, North Texas University, and at Juilliard Jazz. So on this recording, Rick Rowe on piano, Robert Hurst on bass, Nate Wynn on drums, all compositions by Greg Hill and all arrangements by Rick Rowe. And the recording is going to get underway with a tune called Eldon's Bop. It's a short but complete-sounding 20-measure melody that moves some melodic phrases through a lot of changes, but they become familiar-sounding right away. Snappy bass from Hurst and tight hi-hat from Wynn give way to walking bass and cymbals as Rowe gets right into some swinging improvisations with speedy lines. Let's hear this recording get going. Hurst also gets a bass solo on this tune, and Rowe and Wynn trade some fours before getting back to the melody. All that in just over 3 minutes, but it's not the shortest track on the recording. Track 2, Duck's Night Out. This has a rubato longing opening over bowed bass, then things get rhythmic and riffy with neat Latin beats and breaks on the minor melody before Rowe is off on a swinging solo. It seems like a real shame to stop it there, so let's come back in for some more of the piano solo. Yeah, Wynn really fuels things along with drum hits here and throughout the album. Hurst has a bouncy bass solo, and they vamp out on the riff for Wynn to work up the drums before the ending. This one was a lot of fun. Track 3, Mr. P, P-E-A. This is the shortest tune and a really tricky number. Things get going with a Latin feel for 8 measures, but switch up to syncopated piano chords that alternate with interjections from bass and drums. Things then get off swinging with piano improvisations. The feel changes up to Latin again as Rowe continues on with solo ideas, ending suddenly with the syncopated riff from earlier. Track 4, Julie's Tune, a relaxed waltz for this one. There's a 16-measure intro and a 32-measure sparse melody that teases with bluesy implications. Rowe continues on with tasty improvisations with nice articulation. Very tasty playing. I can't get too much of all that's happening there of the melody in just a minute sample. So for this one, I'm going to sample Hurst's bowed bass solo that has some humor and a weeping bluesiness to it. Wind adds a click to the start of the final melody section that really starts to drive it along, but it lightens up toward the ending to show some finesse from Ro's touch. Track 5, Sunday Special. This tune has a split personality over the 24-measure construction. There's a too funky for church gospel-y riff for 8 measures. Then it turns more pious for 6 measures, back to the funky for 4, and reverent again for 6 more. It's a lot of fun. Ro's solo on this tune keeps a foot in both worlds, as does Hurst in his plucked bass solo. Let's check out the ending with more funky fun from Ro. A nice little sanctified ending there. Track 6, Tribute. A 4-measure intro with drum fills brings in the 32-measure melody with a tricky kind of Caribbean feel that switches up to swing on the B section. Things are back to swing for Ro's piano solo. Let's check it out. Really swinging there. Hurst gets another bowed bass solo on this one. Let's check out Wynn's drum solo on this tune. to the melody from there with some drum punctuation at the ending. Track 7, Floating Candles. This is an even beat tune with a 12-measure intro with 3-measure bass and left-hand phrases. The main melody has 4-measure piano phrases that create a constantly rising feel with each section. Rowe shows a soft touch in his solo with high register phrases that tease with chromatic ideas and bluesiness. He builds up to more percussive playing, and Hurst has a busy bass solo with rapid-fire articulation. For the sake of time, I'll leave you to sample this one on your own. Track 8, Ballad. This has a long rubato opening section. It then takes off on a settled-in groove with a minor theme and some tasty piano playing from Rowe. I'm not really sure about the structure here, but let's jump in from there at a little past a minute in. Hurst gets a bass solo on this one too, and Wynne gets to do some drum trading. It ends up in rubato fashion, like the opening. Track 9, Shari Shari, that's S-H-A-R-R-I-E. The intro phrase has 2.5 measures, and that jump-ahead feel gets you ready for what's coming. There's a repeating piano phrase that makes the basis for the melody. After the first 8-measure section, the phrases have 3 measures and then a 2-beat measure that really trips you up. It sounds tricky to play. Things smooth out to a loping walk to get a start to Rowe's swinging solo. Smooth runs and nice little turns there. Let's check out some more of Hurst's playing on this tune. Next, Rowe does some trading with Wynne before getting back to the quirky rhythmic melody. Track 10, Soul Element. A ringing solo piano opening soon becomes rhythmic and syncopated. Things get swinging for 16 measures. The feel then changes up again before returning to the syncopated chord idea. On this one, let's just jump in from Rowe's bluesy and tasty piano improvisations about a minute in. Very nice. Hurst gets a bass solo on this one too, with some very fast finger work. Track 11, Summer Nights. This is delicate and pretty with ringing piano forming a sparse chiming melody. Hurst is soon up for another fleet-fingered bass solo, then rows back with a dreamy solo of sensitive dynamics responding to the rhythmic cues of his bandmates. Let's just check out the start of the tune to the bass solo. And Hurst is off floating on his own there. And the final track is The Singer, a 5-measure intro and a swinging minor melody. It's a 16-measure idea plus one extra measure before repeating. The syncopated chords here create a kind of dangerous-sounding mood. And Hurst goes on with a bass solo from there. Let's just jump back in for one more taste of Rick Rowe's piano improvisations. Nice tasty drum work from Wynn there as well. And that's the album. I continue to be intrigued by the compositions of Greg Hill. There's a lot to enjoy on the surface level with catchy melodic ideas, satisfying harmonic progressions, and a good dose of bluesy leanings in a lot of his songs. Look a little deeper, though, and you'll find another level of interesting twists on structures and challenging unique elements. The previous recordings of Hill's music that we've heard all had larger groups with horn arrangements, so it was a different experience to hear his music in a piano trio format. This trio with Rick Rowe really has good synergy and energy together with balanced contributions. Rowe's arrangements of the tunes are satisfying with lots of different grooves and feels, always getting around to hard swinging before long. His piano playing is classy with inspired solos, a sensitive touch when it's called for, and lots of dynamics and some really rollicking moments too. Hurst shares a lot of the solo spotlight on bass, and his technique and improvised solos are impressive, and Wynn is a good match on drums with great feel and hard-hitting interjections that catch your attention at the right moments. I'm always ready to hear more of Greg Hill's compositions, and now I'm ready to hear more of Rick Rowe's piano playing anytime as well.
Yeah, me too. I really like this album a lot. It's got enjoyable swinging tunes, as you heard, all the way through. All of them are appealing themes, and equally great hooks, too. You got to think of those hooks, After hearing several albums of Greg Hill compositions on this podcast, I'm suddenly more interested in Greg Hill as a composer. The style is in the traditional style of swing composition, and all fall appealingly on the ear, and as Russ mentioned, there's a lot of depth to these recordings, too. There's a lot of, you can listen deeper and hear new things. Mm-hmm. And that's especially true as far as the appeal goes with Rick Rowe's light touch and idiomatic phrasing. He's tasteful and light in his solos, and I also enjoyed bassist Robert Hurst's solos, often playing with the swing feel and the variety of approaches drummer Nate Wynn used in his solos. The whole album is upbeat and light, and so many albums dedicated to Greg Hill's music are like this, but I liked the trio format here. I'm keeping an ear out for his compositions from now on.
Yeah, great sounding recording too.
Yeah.
All right, and that's going to wrap it up for our first episode of New Music in 2025. Thanks as always to Fast Signs of Staten Island for our glowing neon logo, and we're going to be back next week. We've already got things lined up with new releases, all from January 10th, I believe. Mike,
yeah. What's
on the classical menu?
There were a load of good new releases on January 10th, so the new year is starting out really well in classical music. I decided to go for an album, French harpsichord music from the court of Louis XIV by Sophie Yates, a harpsichord player that I remember from the 1990s, where she did a string of great recordings for the Chandos Chacon label. And she doesn't record as much anymore, but this is a new recording, and I thought I'd check this out. We've also got a recording of Beethoven's Missa Solemnis that's getting some buzz for the tempos it uses, and I'm really curious to hear it. So I thought we'd talk about that on the podcast. And orchestra works by a contemporary composer that I'm completely unfamiliar with. I'll tell you more about him next week, Eric Montalbetti. So we'll find out more about that next week. And it's going to be a nice new discovery, I think. So let's give that a listen.
Great. On the jazz side, we're going to go all international, and the theme is really young leaders. None of these guys are over 30 yet. We're going to start out with an Israeli piano trio featuring the pianist Gadi Lahavi. They call themselves the GTO Trio. The recording is called Within on NZIC Records. You're going to really like this one, Mike.
Oh, okay. I'm looking forward to it already.
I've been listening to it all week already.
Wow.
And we're going to go over to the UK for an up-and-coming young saxophonist, Zosa Coles, on a modern genius. That's on Stony Lane Records. And another young saxophonist from Spain, Javier Rojo, on the Fresh Sound New Talent label Música para Amansar Fieras.
Ooh, nice pronunciation there.
Yeah, so looking forward to all these recordings. I've been listening to these since we've had free time all week, trying to decide what are the best ones. And I think I got a nice theme with these. So if you want to check out the classical and jazz recordings for next week, get started listening to the whole recordings as Mike and I are doing during the week. I'll have a playlist up with all those recordings on Deezer a few hours after this episode is released. And that's it. Any final words for this episode, Mike?
Just happy 2025 to everyone. I think it might be a rough year out there, but it's going to be a great year in here.
Just stay inside and listen to music.
Get outside and get some sunlight, though. Don't,
Yeah, you do that too.
Stay healthy.
Put your headphones on and take a walk.
There you go.
Thanks for sticking with us through this episode, and we'll be back again next week with 6 more recordings. So until then, keep listening, and we'll see you again next time.